Good evening. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of this new unit at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. I'm delighted that so many people could join us tonight for this special discussion on religion and the civic sphere with this great lineup of speakers and our ASU colleague John Carlson moderating. The school organizes an entire series of speakers each year and a two-day conference on a theme. This year the theme is polarization and civil disagreement, and one of the panelists we will hear from tonight, Ross Douthat, is a speaker in that series tomorrow night. Same room, same time, so please spread the word. I'm actually worried that all of you made it into the room without having to pick up flyers for everything that we have out there, so be sure to get information outside. Tonight, though, this is a separate opportunity to discuss religion and civic affairs, and the format is a conversation between important national voices. The school is very happy to be collaborating with John and the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict for this event, also with the University of Mary, and with ASU's Council of Religious Organizations. And we have leaders here tonight and members from other campus religious groups, and I can see members of the broader ASU and Phoenix communities with us as well. Our aim tonight is the same as with our broader public affairs series, to provide a forum for civil discussion and debate about important intellectual, civic, and political topics. And just a few words about this school for this broad audience before I introduce our distinguished panelists and our moderator. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership is trying to restore the connection of liberal education and civic education in a university, and also to undertake civic education with a broader community. Our students discuss great works of civic, economic, philosophical, religious, and political thought in our courses, and both in the classroom and beyond, we provide a space for robust yet civil debate. We mostly study works of the Western tradition and American thought, but we have some comparative courses, including one on traditions of political thought in Islam, Hinduism, and Confucianism. Our undergraduate program offers a major and a minor in civic and economic thought and leadership. We supplement that with broader experiences about leadership and statesmanship, such as internships and experiential leading and service trips and public events like this. We see all of that as a foundation for understanding and practicing leadership in 21st century America and our globalized world. Some of the students here tonight have joined us on our first Global Intensive Experience course, which was in India last spring, to encounter India's religious pluralism and liberal democracy. And others have applied for our second course in India, and still others are applying for our course this coming year on religion and politics in Israel and Palestine. So in our traditional courses and our experiential learning courses and our speaker events, we take very seriously the phenomenon of religion, as well as the relationship between belief and philosophy or science, the issues of religion's relationship to politics, and its role in civil society. That brings us to this terrific panel we have tonight and their conversation. Amy Sullivan, all the way farthest from me, is a Chicago-based journalist. She co-hosts the religion and politics podcast called Impolite Company. She's covered the intersection of religion, politics, and culture as an editor for Time magazine, for Yahoo, and the Washington Monthly, and she contributes opinion and analysis to outlets including NPR, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Her book, The Party Faithful: How and Why Democrats Are Closing the God Gap, was published by Scribner in 2008. Ross Douthat, in the middle of our three panelists, joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April of 2009. His column appears every Wednesday and Sunday. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger for theatlantic.com. He's also the film critic for National Review, and as I was just reminded, he's a writer in residence for the Elm Institute in New Haven, Connecticut. His published works include Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. He's co-authored with Reihan Salam of Grand New Party: How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream, of Bad Religion: How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and most recently, To Change the Church: Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. Catherine Jean Lopez is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, where she directs the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society, and she's an editor-at-large for National Review. She's an award-winning syndicated columnist and co-author of How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice. She's written for a range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Stars and Stripes, and the National Catholic Register, as well as First Things. Among other honors, she was awarded the annual Washington Women in Journalism Award for Outstanding Journalism in the Periodic Press from CQ Roll Call in 2016. And finally, our moderator tonight, John Carlson. He's the interim director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict here at ASU, and also associate professor of religious studies. He's the co-editor of and contributor to 3 books, From Jeremiad to Jihad, Religion, Violence in America, Religion and the Death Penalty, A Call for Reckoning, and The Sacred and the Sovereign, Religion and International Politics. He's at work on a monograph entitled Justice This Side of Heaven, Human Nature, Religion, and the Moral Order of Politics. I'll mention just one of his current projects as well, with colleagues Adnan Gopal from the Center and Kristen Gilger, if I'm getting the name right, from the Cronkite School of Journalism here at ASU. He's directing a new project on religion and the media entitled Religion, Journalism, and Democracy. I'll now turn over the event to John Carlson. Please join me for this great panel on religion in the civic sphere.
Thank you very much, Paul, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, thank you especially for inviting us to be part of this panel. There's lots of advantages to partnering with SCETL, among other things being a good unit with conservative bona fides. They have more money than we do. But they're also very generous, and so they invited us to partner with this project, and we said, absolutely, would love to be part of it. I'm also very happy and to be a part of this, up here with this very distinguished panel. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing up here with this very distinguished panel, but I will try to find out. My own. Yes, that's right. I will try to hold my own. So, okay. So I think many of us grew up being told not to talk about religion and politics at dinner. So I'm going to assume that we're all having a late dinner tonight. And because that's exactly what we're going to be doing at this panel. So if there's some who say that religion, like good vodka, should be served neat, well, there's not going to be any of that tonight. We're going to be exploring the role that religion plays in American public life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to be focusing on the civil sphere. So let me say a few words about that and a few questions that we're going to ask. And we've already addressed the most important question of all tonight. The one I've been asked many, many, many times is, how do you pronounce Ross's last name? So now that we're all clear on that, we can move on to the other one. So the questions that I've got in my mind, and I hope some of you are thinking about too, is to what extent does religion, religious belief, participation, promote civility? How is civility part of the civil sphere? And what do we mean when we say we want civility? To what extent should that even be a goal? Civility, of course, can encompass a range of activities, from public dialogue and argument, quite heated debate at times, to passionate civil protests and even civil disobedience. From the civil is the realm of political life. It extends beyond simple matters of state, of law, of government. It encompasses any place where we meet together and engage one another as citizens, as members who hold some kind of common life together, as we do here tonight. So civility isn't just about getting along or not talking about our differences. So if that's not what you had in mind tonight, it might be dinner time after all. So, all right, with that brief introduction, as our president sometimes says, or quite frequently says, we're going to get to the bottom of all this. We're going to do it very soon. Let's get started. And I want to dive head first right in. We're talking about abortion. We're just going to rip off the Band-Aid and get started here. So This is perhaps one of the most, if not the most controversial issue in political life today. I think it's fair to say. Not simply because it's a deeply moral issue, but it's also a very partisan one in which both sides hold very firm views, and they have gotten more perhaps rigid or pure over time. There are fewer pro-choice Republicans, there are fewer pro-choice Democrats than before. So I'm going to start with you, Amy, and we'll just move through this. I want to ask, it's always been controversial, but what's changed in the last 20 years or so that has made this an even more contentious issue, perhaps, than it's been before? And what are the role that religious citizens have played in those changes?
What has changed in the last few decades? A big piece is that there's been a sorting that's going on.
Is mine on? Mine is on. Why don't you take?
Thank you. There can be sharing across political lines. So, the biggest change over the past few decades is that there has been a sorting between the parties. I started working on the Hill in the mid-90s, and it was not unusual to have pro-life Democrats and have pro-choice Republicans. In fact, my first real job, I guess, after college was working for Tom Daschle, and it was working on an effort to find common ground on abortion, John. So I feel like I have a good Lord, 23 years of experience in this. And we, in the course of it, worked with a number of pro-choice Republicans. Just thinking of a few, Susan Collins and Olympia Snow and Arlen Specter and Jim Jeffords. There were, at the time at least, a handful of pro-choice Republicans and even more in the House of Representatives. And at the same time, there were pro-life Democrats who were never going to be with us. At the end of the day, we failed miserably because the pro-choice Republicans thought we had gone too far, and the pro-life Democrats thought we hadn't gone far enough, and we couldn't make anybody happy, which drove me to divinity school and to try to find God in all of this. But that is a whole nother story. The result of that, though, has been that each party sees very little upside in trying to be an open tent when it comes to abortion. And to just take the party that I end up covering most often, the Democrats, what I have seen over the past 6-8 years, say, is a imagining of politics in which it is women versus religion. And I don't think that's accurate, but I think that some people in the party have made the calculation that, for instance, in 2016, that in order for Hillary Clinton to win, you really needed to motivate women, and turnout among women was going to be most important. Therefore, you didn't want to do anything that was seen as reaching out to people of faith who are still, sadly, despite my book, assumed to be conservative and assumed to be, particularly in social issues, conservative. I don't think that has to be, that calculation is correct. I don't think that those two things are diametrically opposed. And we can get into why, but I'll keep this brief for now. I do think that the fight over the ACA and the contraception mandate really solidified this in a way that wasn't true before then. And unfortunately, it's kind of the state of affairs right now in American politics. And I just spent half the afternoon in a Twitter war with people about this. So I don't see it going away anytime soon. So it was over the New York Times piece this morning about efforts of pro-life Democrats, to change the state platform for the Missouri Democratic Party, just to simply say we welcome people who have opinions on both sides of the abortion issue. And you would have thought they wanted to overturn Roe in the platform.
Ross, let me ask you, and you can comment on this, but is it the case that this intense partisanship, and it really seems that both sides, both partisan sides, benefit from that in certain ways, is kind of overdetermined? And let me suggest what I mean by that. Is it, some would say that even if you repealed Roe v. Wade tomorrow, it would not fundamentally transform things, so that much of the stakes about keeping Roe v. Wade legal or trying to overturn it are perhaps presented to be bigger than they might actually be in reality, in practical effects.
So, I mean, I guess I think that's right in technical legal terms, but possibly wrong in sort of big picture cultural political terms. By which I mean, yes, if you overturned Roe tomorrow, a bunch of states that right now have, as many restrictions as they can have on abortion, and often are down to 1 or 2 abortion clinics, would pass more stringent bans, and a few reddish purplish states would pass a 20-week abortion ban, and lots of purple to blue states would basically sort of race to sort of codify legal abortion in their laws or state constitutions or whatever, and the underlying landscape would sort of move a tick in a more pro-life direction, but in the first 5 to 10 years after Roe probably wouldn't change that dramatically. That's true. At the same time, the sort of partisan overdetermination that you're talking about, and that I think Amy is totally right about, is itself in part a creation of the fact that this issue has been judicialized and therefore nationalized, so that every presidential election for people who care about abortion becomes a referendum on abortion, because the president picks the judges, and the judges are the only ones who can overturn Roe. They're the only ones who can uphold Roe. And this has all kinds of spillover effects in our politics generally, but I think it has contributed in a profound way to this sort of steady polarization that was not at all predictable in like 1968 or 1975. It was not at all guaranteed that the Democrats would become the pro-choice party and the Republicans the pro-life party. The early history of anti-abortion activism was very politically complicated. The early history of pro-choice activism was sort of associated with the Rockefeller Republican wing of the Republican Party, and that diminished over time, but it persisted, especially, as Amy says, in the House, where you could have individual congressmen. Dan Lipinski is now basically the last one in the Democratic Party, but you could have individual congressmen who were pro-life Democrats, which then, the further up the Democratic Party ladder they went, the more they had to sort of change those opinions, because they were getting closer to the central lever of power that actually controls the court. So I think an interesting...
Up until 2 years ago, Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, was a pro-life Democrat. Right,
notionally. But I mean, I think his pro-life record maybe diminished slightly as he came somewhat closer to power. But I mean, to me, the interesting question around Roe is would overturning it shake things up again? Would it take us back suddenly or slowly to a more unsettled landscape where you suddenly had many more pro-choice Republicans in the Northeast again, and where you suddenly had pro-life Democrats springing up again in the Midwest? Or have we locked ourselves into this partisan dynamic where it could be overturned and it would still just be a red America, blue America issue? And I don't honestly know the answer. But I think that's the question. That's the thing that could be unsettled more potentially if Roe was overturned. This sense that the parties are now organized around the issue as sort of a sort of absolute partisan issue.
It just seems to me that there's such an incentive to keep it partisan in a way, but if you actually were to make some kind of advance or forward movement, that would open up new possibilities for different kind of political alliances, and could be in fact threatening to political parties.
Well, and I mean, you could I think Amy would probably say this. I don't want to speak for her, but many religious people with some sympathy for the pro-life movement who are not part of the Republican Party look at pro-lifers associated with the Republican Party and say, you guys are always being taken for a ride, basically, because the Republicans never want to actually overturn Roe, because then they'd have to deal with the consequences and lose voters on the one hand who are pro-choice and never expect it to be overturned, to lose voters on the other hand who no longer have a reason to vote Republican. And I mean, it was fascinating to watch the sort of the hinge moment in the Kavanaugh hearings in the end was Susan Collins giving a speech being cheered on by pro-life activists, in which Susan Collins was saying, I'm voting for Brett Kavanaugh because I think he's not going to overturn Roe v. Wade. And somebody's getting taken for a ride here, and in the next 5 years we'll find out who. But it's a really striking dynamic.
Catherine, let me give you a chance to jump in here on anything you want to talk
about. I couldn't agree more with both Amy and Ross. But Amy's point about the hardening that happened during that last presidential election, I was waiting for the moment where Hillary Clinton made a play for pro-life Catholic voters, right, who were looking for a home, looking for an excuse. And now, I wasn't voting for Hillary Clinton. There were a lot of people who weren't voting for Hillary Clinton, but there was an opportunity there for the party. And it would have been healthy, I think, for American politics. Even if she wasn't necessarily sincere, there would have been a movement that would be healthier than where we are right now. And of course, the elephant in the room here is, so I've been at so many conferences in the last 2 years or so, conservative Catholic, for lack of a better word to describe, where Donald Trump appears to be the savior of the pro-life movement, or more, if you want to put it that way. And is that a healthy place to be? And is that even true? And that does assume that you're putting all your eggs in the Supreme Court basket in many ways. Now, there are other incremental things that have happened, regulatory agencies and improvements and things, but where is the long-term win here? And that, of course, is yet to be determined. And I think we're in a really dangerous place where the pro-life movement is owned by Donald Trump at the moment. And no party should own the pro-life vote, first of all, or religious voters. And so, I mean, I really applaud efforts where people are trying to go beyond their party. And one issue area that I've focused on a little bit lately in the last year or so is foster care and adoption. It's nobody's giving it enough attention, and it does seem to be like it could be this common ground area, except that it always has to we always have to get into a debate about religious liberty, right? But if we can, I've actually been at conferences, and these are I have some moments of hope where I'm at a conference at the Brookings Institute, a left-leaning public policy institute, where the Children's Defense Fund and Focus on the Family are having the same conversation about, okay, what's in the best interest of children? And if you can start asking that question honestly, that's an area where there should be some, well, actually, it's immoral not to try to find some common ground.
Just to answer your question directly, because whenever you pick on me first, my brain has to catch up. The thing I kept waiting for in 2016, and really for several of the years beforehand, was for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or somebody in the Democratic Party to stand up and say, we have just lowered the abortion rates more than at any other point since Roe v. Wade. And to take credit for it, to say the abortion rate is now lower than it was in 1972 before abortion was legal in the entire country. Like, it blows people's minds when I walk them through what's happened, and that it has been largely due to economic supports, taking away one of the factors that women say lead them to seek abortions, and through greater availability and access to contraception.
This is a slightly contested point.
It is contested, but I can walk you through the numbers because I've gone through birth rates in the states that instituted more restrictions, and the birth rates have not gone up.
You can save
Birth rates
that
are
one for
falling
dinner,
everywhere.
so.
But yes, just to say, I think that would be a slam dunk appeal from Democrats, and there are complicated reasons why they will not make that appeal. But there's potential there.
All right, let's move on. There's lots of topics here to discuss, and we can return to any of these during the Q&A with the audience. So we've got some midterm elections coming up very soon. There's a lot of discussion about the women's vote, and I'd like to ask you all specifically about religious women voters, understanding, of course, that is not a monolithic category. So if you want to take a stab at talking about Catholic women voters or evangelical women voters, but what are you going to be looking for and thinking about in the upcoming elections in this era now of Me Too, post-Kavanaugh hearings, post-sexual abuse within the Catholic Church, and within the evangelical and conservative churches? And Catherine, I'll go ahead and start with you, and we'll roll that way.
Well, I guess the perennial question at this point is whether Trump is losing evangelical women or not. You know, it's really important, I think, for religious voters to try to lay out some principles rather than be dragged into politics in the way that they have. And it sort of drives me crazy every election cycle where one group of people, religious people, sort of become this political faction. There are groups out there like, and I know at some point we'll talk about the Benedict option and some of the theories floating around right now. But there's a group called the Leonine Forum in Washington, run out of the Catholic Information Center, and the idea, it's been operating for about 5 years now. They take young professionals, a lot of them in politics, and try to teach them Catholic social teaching. They're already engaged in the culture in one way or another, public policy, whatever it is. They probably aren't that well formed. Some of them did go to schools like the University of Steubenville, where they got a good dosage of what the Catholic Church teaches and the Catechism is about and things like this. But now they're hands-on. And so how can you actually form engage in politics, engage in the culture with real principles, and form rather than be formed by the politics or sucked into the politics? And one of the things I'm really looking forward to seeing is how that plays out, in the years to come. There are other groups, like not on a religious necessarily, but the National Review Institute has a fellows program, a regional fellows program. The leadership programs you guys have. That's where we need to be encouraging people rather than being sucked into the partisanship.
Well, now I'm going to say something about the partisanship, and you've made me feel guilty. But I think so my newspaper, the New York Times, had a big piece about precisely those evangelical women, and evangelical women in Texas specifically considering casting a vote for Beto O'Rourke. And that is, so basically what we think of as the gender gap in American politics has been, in the last few election cycles, really a marriage gap, where Republicans tend to win married women quite heavily, and Democrats do much better with single women and divorced women and so on. And because marriage is in somewhat of decline in the United States, that has ended up giving Democrats a large advantage with women, but an advantage that has been sort of limited. And the experience of the Trump presidency seems like it's pushed those limits a little more, and that probably means that more sort of, often evangelical or Catholic, married, Republican-leaning women are considering voting for Democrats. And that, if the election were held today, based on the polling we have right now, the Democrats would probably win the House, and you would look at those results and say, it is a female backlash against Trump that's made the difference. And overall, and we can get into this a little bit more later maybe, but I mean, I think that sort of gender polarization has been, I think to many people's surprise, more of the story of the Trump era than racial and ethnic polarization. For all that Trump, everything to do with the border and Hispanics and immigration and and all of the various racial contretemps and the NFL players and everything else. I mean, there's been so much sort of racial stuff swirling around. For all of that, if you look at how voters are actually affected by the Trump era, the basic democratic advantage with minorities is still there, but it hasn't expanded. And Trump and the Republicans are actually doing a little better than a lot of people expected in polls of Hispanic voters, and even very much on the margin of black voters as well. So the whole sort of post-2016 swing that has the Democrats maybe poised to take the House has been among women. And clearly, I think some of those, again, often religious women who, Amy wished Hillary Clinton had appealed to, ended up holding their noses and voting for Trump, and some of them seem to regret it. And that seems to be a potential big difference maker in 3 weeks.
So the honest answer is I don't know. We do know a few things. We know that there's an enormous gender gap among white, college-educated evangelicals. Among men, about 78% of them still strongly support Trump. Only 51% of women do, and that's an enormous gap. What I don't know is whether that affects the midterms at all. I think it's very likely that a lot of women regret their vote for Trump, and they don't hold it against their local office seekers. What I suspect is that just because I've been talking to and working with a number of white evangelical women leaders who are, let's say, radicalized in the last 2 years, what I suspect is they're paying closer attention to things. So if they happen to have a candidate in their local race who's maybe mouthing off about women staying home, there have been a few choice comments in some races, I bet they're paying attention to that closer than they were in the past. It's been a perfect storm of Trump and some of the issues that a fair number of evangelical women have always, or not always, but the last few years, been really interested in, like working with refugee communities or being in favor of immigration reform. These things are now politicized in a way that they weren't a few years ago, and in a way that affects them. If they're talking about racial reconciliation in their churches, sometimes they're accused of bringing politics into church now. And so I just think that they are possibly viewing politics through a slightly different lens than they were a few years ago. How that all shakes out in the midterms, I simply don't know.
And if I could just add, it was really interesting during the Kavanaugh hearings to watch a lot of evangelical conservative women in particular who wanted a Brett Kavanaugh-like person on the court vote-wise, but were really deeply uncomfortable with how that played out. And Ross would tweet every about 12 hours that Amy Barrett should have been the nominee, right? That certainly wouldn't have played out the way it did. But like you, I don't know how that plays out in the midterms and long term, but there was a real discontent there.
So you all talked about evangelical women voters. What about Catholic women voters? Any differences there that you think are worth pointing out?
I would love to hear from these guys about Catholics because, one of the things we were observing earlier is that it struck people not just that white evangelicals voted for Trump in such high numbers, but that their support has held steady for so long. Because nobody says just because you vote for someone you have to be uncritical of them while they're in office. And in fact, it's perhaps you could argue the opposite. You have a responsibility to hold them to account. Those numbers have not held the same for white Catholics who voted for Trump. And I, from my vantage point, see his White House as perhaps walking the line of being anti-Catholic, and I'd love to know how you guys have seen it.
I mean, so my part of my theory of Trump was that he did really, really well with what you might call the Catholic penumbra, meaning the sort of semi-lapsed Catholic population in the Midwest and to some extent the Northeast as well. People who were sort of culturally Catholic, came from sort of Irish and Italian backgrounds, were not like pro-life traditionalists, and therefore had sort of a loose attachment to the Democratic Party for ethnic and tribal reasons, and really related to Trump. And like Fox News is sort of a like lapsed semi-Catholic outer borough New York kind of network, right? Like and it's I mean, O'Reilly isn't there anymore, but Hannity and a lot of the guys have that sort of affect of like you go to mass a few times a year and you defend the church, but you're not really like you're not reading papal encyclicals and worrying about the theology of the body or something. And Hannity famously had a Catholic priest on his show years ago to yell at him about how he could be a good Catholic and use contraception. This was like a great Fox News clip from a different era in our politics. So what I've seen in polling, I suspect, is Trump losing some of those voters, but not for sort of religious or cultural reasons, but more because they were sort of like Midwestern independents who voted for him because of his promises on economics, and then they were disappointed that they didn't get the big infrastructure bill that he promised, and instead got the Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell economic agenda instead. So my suspicion is that there's more of the losses among Catholics are explained by sort of Midwestern populist disappointment with him than by a sort of specific religious reaction. I mean, that being said, I know people, there is a sort of Catholic female equivalent of the evangelical female discontent with Trump. That's definitely there. There's certainly an analog between the two. But I my guess is that the bigger drop in his polls there is more about sort of economics plus a sort of, I thought this guy was the guy from The Apprentice who would, be a dominant businessman, and instead everything seems in chaos, so I'm not as into him as I was. That's my speculation.
But at the same time, I wonder if that drop-off actually happens. Because, just some of the conversations you have with people, if they are watching Sean Hannity every night,
Right. No, the people who are watching Sean Hannity are not. Let me clarify. They're not. They're voting for Trump. They're going to take down the deep state, whatever way they can. But there's sort of a Hannity beyond.
Right.
People one removed from that. The cousins of the people who watch Hannity.
There you go.
Right. Their cousin Vinny, who's
But one of the things that Trump still has going for him with some of those people is he's still not a politician, and he still tells it like he says it like it is, and so yeah, I don't know how it plays out. I really honestly don't know.
Well, and the shifts we're talking about are one of the startling things is sort of how stable Trump's approval ratings have been since he took office. They're not good approval ratings, and they can but they sort of move. I tell people there's like a wave function of Trump approval ratings, right? Where, when he's raging on Twitter and there's scandals erupting, it dips by 3 points. And then when he doesn't do anything for a while and the economy is good, it floats up by 3 points. And in certain ways, we all have all of our punditry and, all of our attempts to read the midterms, but mostly it's just where does election day fall on that wave function, right? Has he been quiet for a few days? Well, then maybe the Republicans, hold a few Senate seats. Has he been noisy? Then maybe they don't.
All right, well, let's shift gears just a little bit here. As we think about the civil sphere, I want to take up the question of civil religion. And by that, I mean the kind of moral vocabulary that most presidents evoke from either party, and has a long, distinguished history, kind of recalls the moral principles that guide the country, concerns with the universality of freedom, of human dignity, rights, and things of this nature. This president has not been a real strong voice of civil religion, I think we can say. You'll recall just this week he made very clear that he wasn't going to be stopping a $130 billion arms deal just because Saudi Arabia tortured, killed, mutilated one of their journalists, because that's going to hurt American jobs and workers. So I'm wondering, though, if some people now are beginning to question and ask, is the apparently complete abdication of that kind of civil religion, which is this is something that's supposed to hold people in common, that to at least appeal to something that is, American, not just to the base, so to speak. Some people are wondering if there's irreparable damage that's taking place. Can we recover from this as a nation? Is there a possibility for some kind of civil unity, or are we really just headed for this kind of, even in greater polarization headed in the future? So I'll throw that out. Amy, do you want to start?
We can recover, but boy, am I glad my kids are, for the most part, too young to be following what this president is saying, because I don't know how you parent in this moment. Although my 4-year-old is extremely wise, he is also very interested in religion, and he told me a couple weeks ago, "Mama, God loves Donald Trump, but I don't think God likes that Donald Trump is mean to people." And we don't talk about the president much at home, but he is picked up on things, and I think he's wise on that. Certainly there's been a loss of moral leadership. I think a lot of people would argue, and I on some days count myself among them, that it's inappropriate for us to put so much weight on the president to be that sort of moral figure for us. Not that I want an immoral president, but that we have maybe relied too much on presidents to be able to perform a very tricky job of bringing the country together, or at least attempting to. One of the many defining characteristics among Trump is that he does not care to even pretend that he's governing the entire country. And he's been very clear about this from the beginning, that he wants to reward the states that voted for him and reward the people who voted for him, and the rest doesn't really matter. And I can't think of a single other president who didn't at least nod to the idea that we should be one people, and at times be able to bridge our differences. I think depending on how much of his base takes that in and really believes that in their bones, that could be really damaging. But it's going to be. We just had in Obama a president who I thought, as somebody who paid close attention to his religious language and to the talks that he gave at the National Prayer Breakfast, did quite a good job of formulating kind of a civil theology, and was one of the most explicitly Christian presidents that we've had, and yet you still couldn't convince a good 40% of the country that he wasn't Muslim or a godless secularist by the end of his 8 years in office.
Catherine, you want to do? Catherine?
I was thinking, in Donald Trump's mind, he probably thinks that Mike Pence is his cover there. He knows what he doesn't know, and Mike Pence takes care of that. And I do think Mike Pence, to his credit, I do think loves his country and believes certain things, but he is not the president, and so that doesn't quite work. I do think we can recover, but I think it depends on who's willing to fight for basic principles and for party leadership. And the question is, do the parties go along, or are they? And are there movements underlying that appreciate what's come before? At National Review, we talk a lot about Bill Buckley, and he had a very keen sense of gratitude and the patrimony that we've been gifted. And his outlook on public policy was to be a good steward of that, and to always even revel in knowing that we have that as our responsibility going forward. But this isn't meant to be a political criticism. I loved Barack Obama's first campaign slogan, "We are the ones we've been waiting for," because I thought it sort of captured this bipartisan problem where we think, the world has been waiting for this moment where we showed up, and no, we need to be good stewards, and I think the question of whether or not we get to that point again of being grateful for gifts that we've been given probably determines where we go from here.
Does it fall to me to defend Donald Trump?
No, it falls to you to say whatever you'd like to say or to pass.
So they tell you.
I hope someone's live tweeting this if you do.
No, I mean I'm not gonna defend Donald Trump's sort of style as a public theologian. But I will say, I will say that Donald Trump didn't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, when we talk about civil religion in the U.S., historically, what we meant by civil religion was a sort of ecumenical, Americanized Christianity that was sort of undergirded by the stability of mainline Protestantism, right? Of this sort of de facto national church that at a certain point became tolerant and accommodating enough that you could talk about the nation's Judeo-Christian heritage and bring in Judaism, and that Catholics could start to feel at home in the country as well. But basically there was always this sort of understanding that civil religion in the U.S. was Protestant and was connected to the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists and all of the different sort of denominations working against each other but also together. And mainline Protestantism fell apart, or maybe it sort of triumphed, and in triumphing shed its institutional form and just became some sort of vague spirit in the air. But either way, there's no institutional foundation for American civil religion anymore. And the last two presidents before Trump, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, were both in their own ways very religious men, very idealistic men. Both of them gave speeches that were meditations on political theology in different ways and so on. But neither of them, I think, were ultimately successful at it. George W. Bush was trying to sort of put together a kind of evangelical Catholic coalition to replace the Protestant mainline. It was like the mainline is gone, but evangelicals and Catholics together can build this sort of religious common ground, or a new religious center for the country. And it didn't work. Instead, half the country thought George W. Bush was a dangerous theocrat who was going to turn America into Gilead before Mike Pence turns it into Gilead, which is the real endgame. So that was sort of the Bush project. And then the Obama project, I think, started out promisingly with a kind of, in the years when Amy was writing her book, there was sort of a real sense of like, well, we can do more, Democrats can do better religious outreach, we can reach out to, pro-lifers who might agree with us on other issues, we can be sort of the ecumenical big tent that the religious right failed to be. And in the end, I don't think it was Obama's fault per se, but across the course of his presidency, that fell apart too. And one of the reasons at the end of it, one of the reasons people thought of him as a secularist was not just right-wing paranoia, it was that it was hard to distinguish, how his governing agenda would have been different if he had just been a secular liberal. So you had those two presidents, sort of both of whom basically failed in their efforts to be sort of prophets of civil religion. And now we've got Trump, And Trump is a kind of, he's a corrective. He is sort of the rawness of politics without the balm of civil religion, and it's not pleasant to live through. But there are things you can learn from it. Like when I talk to my kids about the president, you can say things like, put not your faith in princes, right? Or maybe Daddy agrees with some of this president's policies and also still thinks he's a bad man in certain ways, and that, kids, tells you something important about politics and adult life that maybe I wish you'd learned when you were 13 instead of 7, but you're asking, so I'm telling you now, right? Like that. I don't. Again, it's not a defense, but Donald Trump is a president for a country that doesn't have a robust religious center anymore. And we're going to get right-wing versions of that, and we're going to get left-wing versions of that as the next 30 or 40 years unspool. And hopefully Trump is the coarsest example, but it won't be the last time, I think, that we have a president who just sort of says, look, we don't have a religious center anymore, or maybe Oprah is our religious center, and I'm not going to pretend that we do and pretend to be the pastor of the Church of America.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more quick round of questions here, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But we often think about, when we talk about religion and politics, the way in which religious communities, actors, individuals shape or influence political life. I want to invert that question just a little bit and ask about the way in which our current political landscape is reshaping religious life. There's raising questions about what it means to be or call oneself an evangelical. It's something you thought a little bit about, Amir. You've also talked about, I'll start with you. You've talked about the rise of Fox evangelicalism. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So just a little disclosure on the topic of evangelicals. I'm a progressive. I've worked for Democrats. I'm an evangelical. I'm Baptist, in fact. Baptists are kind of feisty evangelicals. And I've had a lot of fellow travelers stop using that label to describe themselves because they believe the political connotation of it, that it says something about who you vote for and what your position is on certain issues, has swamped anything else. I refuse to drop it, at least so far, because to me, it's a theological description of my faith and my orientation towards God. And it meant that before it meant anything else, before the religious right existed. This may be a losing battle I'm in, but there's no question that this label, evangelical, has come to mean many different things. One of the things we found during the 2016 primaries was that there were a not insignificant number of people who were voting for Donald Trump who self-identified as evangelicals and also never went to church, which for evangelicals is kind of part and parcel of being evangelical, is being in fellowship with other Christians, which told us that there was this cultural evangelicalism that most people would have told you was an oxymoron. You could be a cultural Catholic, a cultural Jew. You couldn't be a cultural evangelical. Well, now you can. One of my theories has been that it is more of a political tribe that adopts the evangelical label because it has this political meaning. And so the one issue that I wrote about a year ago was gun rights. That I was surprised. I ended up a few years ago in North Dakota at a Bible college for a screening of a movie that was basically arguing that the pro-life position on guns is to want to combat gun violence. That you couldn't consider yourself wholly and comprehensively pro-life and also be opposed to any restrictions on gun ownership and gun use. And I was caught unawares because I found myself surrounded by Bible school students who argued basically Fox News talking points that had been married with a theology that backed a political position they already had, which was to be pro-gun rights and to argue that this was the biblically determined position to hold. I don't think there is a way to read swords into plowshares differently, and I know people of good faith differ about gun ownership and all of that, but there were some extremely convoluted theological gymnastics taking place in this Bible college to come to a position where their politics and their religion could be as one. And it's just, again, one of many issues. I think when you've got Robert Jeffress down in Dallas endorsing the idea of just nuking the heck out of North Korea and deciding that would be a biblical thing to do.
Well, he's probably in favor of negotiating now, though, because Trump is.
Of course,
so,
of course, he will have changed it.
Yeah,
But just to say, we have seen in the last few years that there is no limit to the theological gymnastics some of Trump's evangelical supporters are willing to put themselves through in order to reconcile that support with their faith.
I want to get to the audience questions, but just a quick question first for Ross. Is there a Catholic variant of Fox evangelicals, would you say?
I mean, yeah. I don't think, the only qualifier I would put on Amy's argument is that this is true on the other side, whatever it may be as well, that sort of, the story of American religion generally, with or without Fox, over the last 40 or 50 years, has been that, these sort of these syntheses that religion can hold up in counterpoint to partisanship, where you can be a pro-life Democrat and you can sort of be a Republican who's in favor of prison reform and so on. Those syntheses have been the idea that your Christian faith calls you to something sort of that isn't just partisan politics. That's been ground away all over, and it's more evident in certain ways on the Republican side because the Republican Party is the more religious party. There are more religious believers in the Republican Party than elsewhere. But it's also true of that it's very hard to look at certain elements of resistance culture in the U.S. and not see a kind of conflation of religion and politics that doesn't want to acknowledge that it's tacitly religious, like the sort of rituals of secularism have their own religious bent, I think. And I'll just leave it there.
And the only thing I'd add is to repeat a point you made earlier, Ross. Trump didn't start the fire on all this. I remember being at the Pro-Choice Religious Coalition, is that the name of the group? Explaining where in the Bible, abortion rights was, and being at an evangelical conference where they're explaining to me where the flat tax is in the Bible, neither of which I think we can actually, it's gymnastics
the flat tax is
clearly
there.
Oh,
it's
yes,
there.
clearly.
It's there.
Deuteronomy, I think, right?
Phil Graham told us that.
The Book of Norquist.
Okay. Well, we would like to now move to open the floor to audience questions. I'd note the emphasis on questions. If you have a monologue, auditions for the monologues are tomorrow, same place. Come on back. But please, if you do have a question.
I'm speaking here tomorrow, so you're having.
Oh, okay.
them,
well, no, right, not tomorrow. Yes. Well, so anyway, come on up and please.
Try not to be attacked by the microphone.
Right.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to religion and diversity and how that has played out in the rise of Donald Trump. Specifically being minority racism, how religion has, impacted that.
So one thing that has just struck me is the extent to which religion, even more than in the past, it seems like, has been a cudgel. And by that I mean, after the election, started attending and have now joined a Black Baptist church. We had just moved to the area a few months before the election, and I really needed a church after the election. So I started going, and at the same time that I was hearing from so many religious conservatives that the election of Donald Trump was the fulfillment of God's will, I was surrounded, sometimes on social media, but in this case, literally in church, by people who really feared that they were going to suffer materially, and that they felt threatened. And it just struck me, the idea that by saying Trump's election was divinely ordained, you were telling these fellow believers in Christ that God wants you to feel afraid. God wants you to have this terror in your heart, that was irresponsible, and that again, a lot of this is not new. It has just come into such sharp relief in the past few years in the way that it hasn't before, and that is what undergirds a lot of what we talked about with evangelical women who had their breaking point, not just when the Access Hollywood tape was released because what it said about Trump, but more about what the response or non-response from male religious leaders told them. That I had so many women tell me, I have lived my entire life being told by these same guys that my worth as a Christian was tied to my sexual purity. And then it turns out it didn't matter. Or it didn't matter for this guy. It still matters for me, apparently. But that it was all a lie. And those are the fracturings that, as a religion reporter, I'm paying attention to, and that I think are at least, if not more, significant than the fracturings taking place in our political realms right now.
If you do have a specific question for one of the panelists, direct it accordingly. Otherwise, it's fair game.
Well, actually, I feel like my question plays into what you were saying about theological or mental gymnastics. One of the big issues that I feel plays a factor in that is people who claim to have a certain principle but don't really have a way to defend it, or maybe truly don't know why they have that principle. So how would you justify what you believe are, and this more to everyone, how would you justify what you to believe are core American principles, or at least your principles are, without just relying on simple statements like my religion tells me to do this, or my family believes this, or the law says this?
That's a really easy question. Thanks. Catherine.
It's an important one, and I'll just give a quick stab at this before I'm throwing it to these guys, because in many ways we use religious language because it's the only model that we've had. When I look at American history, I kind of date the beginning of, even though we've had religious people in politics and we've had religious language, it was really, ironically, a Democrat coming into the White House, Jimmy Carter, who brought it in full. Before that, neither party was seen as particularly more religious than the other. And I think it was after Nixon and Watergate that people realized, whoa, maybe I need to know more than just like the policy positions of the guy who's going to be in the White House. I need to know about their character. Well, then the question is, how do you determine a person's character? And religion became the proxy for that. And I don't know if it was always going to become the proxy or if it just was because this Sunday school teacher who talked about being born again was the next guy who ran for the White House. But we, I think, could do with some more secular examples of how to talk in moral terms that don't have to be so strictly religious or sectarian.
You're preparing your monologue, so I don't know if you need more time or not. All I was going to say is my crazy thought in the last couple of years, both in politics and religion, and the upheaval and the anxiety is, I mean, especially what the Catholic Church is facing right now. You know, the question everyone gets, Ross, every hour, right? How can you remain Catholic, right? Well, it's because it's about more than who your pastor is or who your pope is or who your cardinal is. There's stuff we believe, right? And the challenge of this moment is the challenge that should have been every day. How do we share that? How do we explain it? How are we living witnesses of that so that people say, oh, there's something to that beyond who you voted for or what your talking points are, or what your political position is. It was always more than a political position. But now, in a particular way, people are forced to really understand and explain why they are who they say they are. And if they really are who they say they are too, is also obviously part of this all.
I feel like neither of you guys really answered the question, though. Which was like, how do you justify
and don't
what
you live your
believe,
life
right?
not answering questions?
No, totally. That's the nature. That's the nature of journalism. You just raise them, you don't answer them. I mean, I think one way to think about an alternative non-answer that maybe is somewhat responsive to your question is, you know, there are a lot of worldviews that there are a lot of different worldviews that could make sense, but not all worldviews make sense together. And, you know, we've been talking a lot about the challenges for American Christianity and religious believers and how you deal with, you know, a sex abuse scandal or the problem of Donald Trump and so on. But one reason that despite all of these internal problems facing religion, secular liberalism is not exactly carrying all before it in the Western world right now, is that secular liberalism is totally incoherent in a way that, you know, even those gun-loving Bible thumpers or abortion-loving Protestants don't come close to matching. Secular liberalism is a worldview that basically says we're going to marry an ethical tradition inherited from Christianity to a, you know, Darwinian materialist world picture, and we're going to pretend that it all hangs together. And it doesn't really. And people have sort of stuck with it because they looked at the attempts to sort of forge a really coherent post-Christian ideology and in Soviet communism and Nazi Germany and said, well, that was pretty morally horrifying. Maybe we'll just stick with this sort of incoherent muddle. But it remains a deeply unsatisfying, incoherent muddle, and a less coherent one than the forms of Christianity that, you know, were present at the American founding and influential in American history, less coherent than the one true church to which Catherine and I belong. You know, we're taking applications later. There's never been a better time to become a Catholic. Buy low, sell high. And so this incoherence then manifests itself in the derangements of our time. The fact that people, you know, the appeal of religious fundamentalism, the appeal of just plain tribalism. I mean, this relates to the earlier question, but about, like, you know, a less religious society becomes a more ethnically polarized society because people then define themselves by their tribes rather than a universal faith. And a lot of what's happening, what's happening in America is happening everywhere around the world. Brazil is about to elect a Donald Trump. Most of the rising powers of the world are now ruled by nationalist authoritarians in the style of Trump. This is not a sort of specific to America moment, and it's worth recognizing in that moment the limits of the paradigm that informs all of our best and brightest secular liberal leaders who woke up the morning after Trump's election and didn't know what the hell had happened.
Just a protest that
Is this about the one true church? Or
I
no?
think that
Baptists, man.
priesthood of the believer. I think there's an unfair conflation of secular liberalism and the resistance, which is in large part driven by religious liberals themselves, and has at its core a very coherent theological belief. And it could be as simple as the common good, but we can argue about that over dinner.
Okay, so I would like to ask that you please offer a very short question, direct it to one of the speakers, and I would like to invite our panelists to offer a short response. Yes.
Not a 1,000-word soliloquy against modern liberalism, you're saying.
Don't blow through all of your op-eds.
He didn't name anybody.
I'm aiming this at everybody because the four of you are examples of the reason I come to these things. I learn a lot. Thank you. I do have one question in two parts. It is political and religious. The political is assuming the GOP has had a body blow the last 30 years. Are they going to be able to reconstruct themselves? And if they do, how will they do that? Along what lines? And secondly, the religious question. My wife was raised Pentecostal. I was raised with absolutely nothing. We both wound up very secular. And that's what's happening to an awful lot of people. How do people like us, who have no sense of anything supernatural, relate to people who do? And how do we build a common society?
More easy questions.
Yeah. Who's going to take this one?
Well,
Catherine, you got it.
The way you relate to people and people who are religious relate to you is as neighbors. You have to start, I think, with that very basic level and an appreciation of, we're not all that scary, you're not all that scary, and we, eat dinner.
I'm a little scary.
We actually do have things in common, and I think that's where you start.
We are fellow citizens tonight, all of us here. That's one way to think about it.
Quickly on the Republican Party question, I think the future of the Republican Party is basically going to be determined by whether people can incorporate Trump's populism and nationalism into a more decent and morally humane vision. And you're not going to have a return to George W. Bush even. You're not going to have, the populist nationalist turn, I think, is permanent. And the question is going to be, can you have a conservative populism that is pan-ethnic rather than white identity politics? And I don't have any optimism necessarily about that, but that's basically what outsiders to the party should be looking at and either hoping for or fearing.
Okay, so now we're going to do the question qualifiers here get more intense as the evening goes on. So now we're going to do two questions at a time, and if you have a person that you want to direct it to, please do that. We'll do two and then and put those in play. So first question up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Since Mitt Romney is in all likelihood going to be a senator soon, if any of you had any ideas on the direction the Mormon Church will be going in terms of politics.
Okay, great. A question about the direction of the Mormon Church, and next question. Yep, we're going to do it at a time here.
So I was wondering if any of you could speak to LGBTQ plus rights and how political/religious perspectives have shifted from the George W. Bush presidency to Donald Trump's presidency.
Outstanding. So the direction of the Mormon Church and the direction of LGBT plus movements clearly going on the same road there, right? Okay, so who wants to take that one first?
I'll take the second one quickly.
Okay.
Definitely one of the things that's happening that I happen to think is a good thing, is that people have to become more clear about where they stand. There's a movement that I talk up as much as I can called Church Clarity, which is basically trying to develop a clearinghouse, so a list of as many churches as they can, coded not necessarily by whether they are pro-LGBT ordination or marriages or membership, but whether they've been clear. Because knowing where the generational movement on gay rights is going, a lot of churches, particularly very popular mega churches, are choosing to be a little squishy about that. So you don't know for sure. And the thrust of this movement is to just make people say, where are you on it? And I think that has been sorting itself out on the left, and I think it's going to start sorting itself out as some churches do the math and figure out where their younger pew fillers are coming from.
Anyone want to tackle the question on Mormonism?
Well, Ross and I were reminiscing earlier about how when Mitt Romney first was looking at running for president, there were these junkets and Mormon church leaders would come sort of court you to answer all your questions about the Mormon church. And I actually think that was a concern that they had that was overblown, that everyone was going to start to attack the Mormon church. And Mitt Romney has actually probably been a good thing for the Mormon church, because he comes off as a relatively normal, upstanding citizen, whatever you think of him politically. And I guess that was sort of an interesting end to all of that.
I think it might be useful to think henceforward of the Mormon West as the liberal wing of the Republican Party, which might be a strange way to think about it because Mormons are not known for their liberalism. But if you think of the Republicans as trending in this populist nationalist direction, I think it's not a coincidence that figures like Romney and Jeff Flake and others are most uncomfortable with it and for sort of are not likely to ever leave. Unlike other sort of moderate to liberal groups, they're not going to leave the Republican Party, but they might be the sort of persistently the least Trumpy wing of a Trumpy party.
I think particularly on immigration issues as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And you've just gotten a preview of a New York Times column.
Well, we need Flake to challenge Trump in a primary to justify that column.
All right, next two questions.
Well, I had three coming up, and then.
Oh no, I meant from the next two people, not.
I'm just going to give you one.
All right.
What is
an aneurysm?
Wait, three parts.
To get to Ross's deal of a coherent secular vision? What is the problem of viewing individuals by character and integrity that would fit a religious profile or a civil profile and making your judgments rather than bad or good in the sense that they're going to follow my prescriptive political view, but they are of good character?
One more, yeah.
Maybe we should do all three.
All right, we'll
together.
just we'll
three
just knock
questions,
these all
three
out.
about.
So let me preface this by saying, first of all, thanks for a great panel so far. However, this panel
It's about to take a dark turn.
was on religion in the civic sphere, and so far it's been about religion in the American civic sphere. So I wanted to ask you to simply comment, a very open-ended question, on the civic sphere as such, particularly as it's been imagined in various different domains that are supposed to transcend politics in particular ways and be a foundation for, what in the good old days of a half a decade ago some people called a post-national political order. So universals, and I'll just throw out three examples. The market, kind of quasi-secular notions of human rights or human dignity. They're supposed to be that secular moral vocabulary. And science and technology as foundations for forms of social order that transcend politics.
Thank you. My question is a little bit general. My question is, is it better having religion separated from the country or not? What I mean about that, is it acceptable to state laws according to the major religion in the country? Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a question about character and whether this needs to be secular or religious, questions about universals, and a question about majority religion as a basis for a state religion. So.
Well, on the first question about character, the problem is as we've discussed, everything's become so nationalized and so polarized, and the stakes are too high, right? So it becomes, we don't care what his morals are as long as they'll give us the right Supreme Court justices. And we need to get beyond that, which I think is the point but it's not happening in 3 weeks, unfortunately.
But also, when you have a breakdown in the kind of coherence I was talking about, it's not surprising that you get a breakdown of consensus about what constitutes character. Of course, you can have a non-Christian or non-religious conception of good character. I think the problem is we don't have an agreed-upon consensus, and now liberals pine for the sort of 50s morality of Mitt Romney now that Donald Trump is president. But when Mitt Romney was running for president, it wasn't like he was the guy who had given people cancer by laying them off and so on. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of good character figure right now who could unite our culture in a consensus that this is actually a good person. I think even Mother Teresa, maybe especially Mother Teresa, wouldn't make the cut. Amy, answer one of the other questions quick.
So character doesn't count as a universal either, then?
Well, that's unfair. Well, the interesting thing on the universals is, and this may be just we spend too much time in the political realm, which may be why we didn't get onto other areas. But in several of the ones that were mentioned, including science and technology and the market, there should be natural areas of overlap between, I would say, even secular liberals and some religious conservatives. But this is part of why I was talking about Fox evangelicals. Is I'll just use my favorite example for this, which is the stupid war on Christmas, and the idea that somehow going to your favorite big box store and demanding that they say Merry Christmas to you is upholding Christian values. I would argue, and have argued to the annoyance of most people who know me, that the most Christian thing you can do is not go shopping around Christmas, and that should not be.
Are you an American? I mean,
we don't even have a Christmas tree in our home because that's not Christmas to me.
Actually, my favorite is the joy on the Dunkin' Donuts cups, as if they are actually delivering you joy.
And you would think that there would be some overlap in anti-materialism and anti-consumerism between the left and the right there. And yet, it has just become kind of a proxy. All of these areas are proxies in the larger fight, which I don't know at base if it's a culture war or if it is a political war. But that's how people have sorted themselves out. And for the moment, I think that's how in all of these universal areas, it's breaking down. And that's a very negative way to end this all.
Well, I mean, it kind of be the optimistic note I'll strike is I do think it's a travesty, for instance, that like even Amnesty International isn't about human rights. It's gotten co-opted by some political issues domestically, and we can't afford for that to happen because they do important things, and bigger than American politics levels. But I mean, the non-negative way to end, is it's a challenge, right? I mean, and it's why you've got programs like this. You didn't pay us to say that, but I mean, are you willing to fight or not? Is the question.
Technically, they did pay us
I
to
guess,
say that.
yeah, sorry.
I mean, we need
Thank
to
you
be
for being
honest. We need
honest
to be
here.
honest here.
Well, they didn't
They're
make
feeding
us say
too.
that.
I mean, they're
But speaking of feeding, actually, it is everyone has delayed their dinner because of our opportunity here to talk about religion and politics. So we should release everyone for the evening. But before we do that, are you going to dismiss
Yes,
us, Paul? Okay.
yeah.
But before we do that, let me just make a special pitch and thank everyone for coming, but also for recognizing here the importance of the particular, of the local, of being in the same room and talking across the aisle, and recognizing that we are all citizens here, and we can talk about our differences, and we can do this in civil ways and important ways. I just think this is a really great opportunity to do that. So,
good. Just a brief thank you, John.